May I welcome everyone to this webinar, and especially may I welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Peter Boden from Edge Analytics. So Peter is a geographer by background. He did his PhD at the University of Leeds in geography with focus on population forecasting and the role of internal migration in that. And since he has been involved in quite a lot of work, also through the consultancy company he's running, so the Edge Analytics, which he's representing today, for a variety of clients from different sectors, public and private alike. So today's talk will be, as you can see on the screen, about demographic change, the practical application of population forecast to the planning process. So we'll be very eager to hear about, especially about the practical aspects of the work on demographic forecasting and related questions. And may I suggest that we leave the main questions until the end of the talk, which will be about 35-40 minutes in length. But of course, if there are any sort of quick questions for clarification, please feel free to raise your hands, and we can address them as we go along. And finally, as you know, the talk is being recorded, so by participating in this webinar, you implicitly giving consent to being recorded as well. But the discussion will not be recorded, so the recording will stop after the main presentation. So once again, very warm welcome to everybody. Very warm welcome, and thank you to Peter for accepting our invitation. And I'll hand over to Peter for his fascinating talk about demographic change. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jakob, and hello to everybody. Just so that everybody understands the geography, I'm in Leeds. I'm a place called Horsforth, which is northwest of Leeds city centre. I'm sure you're all scattered around the country, but when the wind is blowing outside the window behind me, so hopefully my internet connection will last for the full hour. I'll jump straight into a quick profile of myself, just to give you an indication of the history of my own sort of personal development. As Jakob said, I did both a degree and a PhD at the University of Leeds. I was very grateful for some fantastic supervision from Professors Rees and Stillwell during my PhD, for external supervision from Professor Tony Champion, and also for the support that I got from what was then OPCS and a lovely man called Lak Balusu, who helped me enormously with the processing of huge numbers of magnetic tapes containing migration data. But that was a great time, really enjoyed that. But 1989, 1990, I had to make a choice about which way I went, into academia or into business. And a spin-out business formed by Professor Alan Wilson and Martin Clark at the University of Leeds was being formed at that time. So I jumped into there and then spent quite a chaotic few years in the application of geographical modelling methods to business. In this case, it was very much sort of retail planning type activities. We did huge amounts of work in the automotive industry, within the petrol forecourt industry, supermarkets. So that was interesting, chaotic, because it was a business that did extremely well. Technology was just developing, so we were making the most of technology as we went along. I had a quick 1 year out to do an MBA, which was a great relief for me. But eventually that business was taken over and became part of Core Credit Group, which is a sort of multifaceted, multidimensional analytical business. But I moved into a fascinating field of credit analytics. This was all pre-financial crash, and I was working specifically on a product which was designed to look at the relationship between individuals' debt and their income, which given that we had access through to everybody, the whole country's credit history, it was a fascinating insight to what ultimately led to the financial crash in 2007-8. I'd sort of decided in the early 2000s that I really needed to get out of working for big businesses. I found financial institutions particularly arrogant in their approach to to provision of credit, and I'd had enough of working for large sort of international corporate entities. So I formed Edge Analytics in 2005 with an objective of getting back to basics, really, getting back to trying to help in the application of geographical modelling methods, specifically to demographic analytics, and how we could use that to improve the planning process in different sectors. And it was a bold ambition at the time, but here we are in 2022, still doing that and still enjoying it. But I'm now very much taken a back seat with the business, because in 2020 it was taken over and is now run by its employees. Edge Analytics is based at University of Leeds. That is the grand spanking new Nexus building that was opened 4 or 5 years ago, and we moved in there on its open date, but we haven't been there since March 2020. Like everybody else, we spend most of our time working in our little offices at home. But our business is a data science business, but we have a particular expertise in demographic modelling, forecasting, and optimization. And I say at the outset that before somebody tells me off for using forecasting rather than projection, those two words are interchangeable in the presentation that I'm making. But the meat of the presentation is around case studies. I thought this was the best way of doing it, was to give an idea how we've actually applied and been forced to apply demographic forecasting methods to sectors where there is a regulatory requirement, a mandated requirement, to use evidence, to use robust methods and robust evidence to support planning for the future delivery of these particular services: homes, school places, water and sewage services. Pretty challenging. Forecast horizons for the sort of planning horizons typically vary between 5 and 75 years, which has proved quite challenging, given that the need to try and look at what's happening at the end of this century. And what is also quite challenging is that each of these sectors, it's very much subject to public and expert scrutiny. So we have to be seen to be doing things properly, for want of a better word. I think before leaping into the case studies, I think it's always I'm always fascinated, and I like to present these to students and to clients, these charts, but there's some key factors to understand when considering demographic change and its future impact upon the provision of products and services. So this is the progression of live births since 1950 in the UK. The thick black line is when I was born, 1963, which increasingly seems a long time ago. I'm amazed now to think that 1963 was only 18 years after the end of the Second World War. You don't fully appreciate that, I think, when you're young. But I was born in 63. My wife was born in 64. So we were born at this peak in birth numbers, which thereafter have sort of cascaded and roller coasted over the last 50, 60 years, and all those birth numbers have a fundamental impact upon the shape of the population and now the aging of the population. I put a little red dot in around 2000. In 2000, I became a school governor at my local primary school, and we jumped straight into a program of school closures and rationalisation, all driven by the fact that green bar was coming down and down. And lo and behold, in 2001, 2002, the bar starting to increase again. So a program of rationalisation turned into ultimately a program of considerable increase in the availability of school places, certainly in and around Leeds. The other obvious factor to consider, which has changed dramatically over the years, is the impact of international migration. And this really has been, in all the work that we've been doing since I started doing this sort of commercially, if you like, since 2005, has been the key driver of population growth. It's interesting because COVID has suddenly interrupted things, and Brexit has certainly provided an interruption to international migration. But for us, for the UK as a country, it is critical. International migration will continue to be critical for the long-term maintenance of the UK labour force. So any sort of reduction in net international migration, which I think COVID impact suggests that it's been about 50k net over the last couple of years. I think if you continued with net immigration at those levels in the long term, then we would inevitably see a decline in the UK population. So the sort of balance of births, deaths, and international migration have given us that sort of profile of annual growth rate since 1955. There you can see the impact in the 70s of low number of births and low international migration, the relatively low growth rates, which have been transformed into high growth rates more recently. But those growth rates have begun to fall as birth numbers have fallen, as the number of deaths is rising as the population ages, and as international migration falls. So it looks very much like the growth rate will continue to fall due to the negative balance of births and deaths, which is forecast, and also lower international migration looking into the future. Projection accuracy, that's always something that I'm sure people always are interested in this, and our clients are always interested in, well, how accurate are these? Well, as accurate as they can be given the data that we've got. I've just pulled together, this has come from a report produced by the Office of Budget Responsibility, I think the OBR, using ONS statistics, but these are the accuracy of sort of successive national projections. So historically, the UK population has risen more than projected, but with just one exception, and that's the grey bar there, which shoots up into the stratosphere. So the 1965 based population growth trajectory was based upon the continuation of that high fertility rates experienced in the early 1960s, which actually peaked in 1964, the year that my wife was born, falling thereafter to a record low in 1977. So in subsequent years, projections have typically underestimated future population growth due to one or more of three factors: so that the allocation of insufficient growth through international migration, a failure to anticipate a return to higher fertility rates, and thirdly, a failure to anticipate the continued improvements in life expectancy. But certainly more recently, the forecasts, the projections have demonstrated greater convergence with lower international migration plus reduced assumptions on long-term fertility rates and improvements in life expectancy, which have a dampening effect on population growth outcomes. And we'll return to that later in the presentation. But jumping into case study one, schools. Schools are regulated by the Department for Education. And again, there are, as in each of my three case studies, there are a set of regulatory guidelines, policy guidelines that our clients have to adhere to in producing evidence to support planning of schools, homes, water resources. So this is the DFE's guidelines. There's something called SCAP, which is the annual school capacity survey, which collects information on the primary and secondary school capacity for the current academic year, and then for future years, 5 years in the case of primary schools and 7 years in the case of secondary schools. And the template you see there looks a bit clunky, but that is a template that has existed for some time, and every local authority has to produce that template and submit that template around about June, July every year, which and what is in there is that for every planning area, which is a group of schools, the local authority has to produce a forecast of the number of school places that are expected in each of the school years. And here this is presenting it in secondary school years. So secondary school starts at year 7 and then goes up to year 13, with year 12 and year 13 being sixth form or sixth form college. The geography that we're dealing with here is a little bit complex, because this is West Sussex as an example. In West Sussex is split into its constituent local authority districts, but then the schools don't the school planning areas don't adhere to those local authority districts. So you can see these are the coloured dots are the primary schools, and the colour of the dots relates to their planning areas. So you can see Chichester itself is split into 3 or 4 or 5 different planning areas, which are simply the amalgamation of schools. They're not geographical areas. The planning area, from education perspective, is a school. So the forecasting process that we apply has to model the relationship between where pupils live and which school they go to. And I think it's fair to say this is the most complicated modelling process that I have been involved in all my time, working from when I started at GMAP in 1990 to where I am now. Modelling schools is incredibly challenging because of the complexity of the data, but also because you've got different operating systems. Sometimes you've got 2-tier and 3-tier schools. You've got to account for closure of schools, opening of schools. You have different years of entry. Some schools let their children in reception, some at year 3, year 5, year 7, year 9. All these things need to be accommodated into a modelling approach that provides the full SCAP output. So that's it is a cohort methodology, but it's not a typical population projection model that we're applying here. It's a cohort methodology in that it's aging children through the school year groups, and it takes account of fluctuating birth numbers, migration, house building, and then the opening and closure of schools. So if you take that model from left to right, we begin with a sort of pool of resident preschool children. That's children who are aged 0 to 4. We take those children into primary schools. We then age those children from reception through to year 6 in their primary school, taking account of any migration into or out of the school and any new homes that are built in the catchment areas around those schools. Those children typically at the end of year 6 will then move into secondary. Some will stay in this sort of mainstream schools. Some might go into the private sector, but the majority will go into secondary schools. We're then putting them and transitioning them into year 7. And then same again, we're progressing them through year 7 to 11, taking account of any migration or yield from housing. And then some children will leave, but others will move into sixth form. We're doing the transition again, and then moving them through to year 12, 13, and in some cases there is a year 14 when children are staying on for an additional year. So it's a complex modelling process, and it's done at school level. It typically uses a very disaggregate, typically a sort of ward geography as our geographical units, and then modelling the interaction between where children live by their ward and then into the schools in which they go to. Fundamentally, we're using school census data, which is a very detailed history of where children live and where they go to school. And we're combining that with demographic data, which we need on the projection of births, because that's what's feeding children into the school system. And then also on planned housing in local catchment areas and what our yield factors will be associated with that housing growth. So it's complicated. If you go back to an area like this, you can see the complexity of the schools and the geography that is involved. We've just completed work for Birmingham City Council, which is the largest local authority of just over 1 million population. So you can imagine the complexity of trying to produce school-specific forecasts for them. But we did it. And scenario output, typically we try to ensure that as much of what we do is as visually impressive as possible. So this is an example of the type of information that we're producing. This is for the Addleston and Ottershaw planning area. It shows forecasts for years after 6, which it means for primary school years. And then I suppose the charts at the top give an indication that we're suggesting that the numbers in primary schools are going to rise up until about 24, 25. But then in line with the reducing birth numbers, which we've been seeing over the last 6 or 7 years, the numbers within primary schools are going to starts to reduce. And then the color-coded bar chart on the right-hand side gives an indication that in that period from 2021 to 2027, there is a deficit of school places forecast for Addlestone and Aldershot, but then that's going to turn itself into a surplus thereafter as the smaller birth cohorts move through the system. So it's a really fascinating sort of geographical and demographic modeling exercise that really does go down to the individual school level, but is then reported to the DFE at planning area level. The DFE amalgamate all that data for the whole country and then use that intelligence on an annual basis as the fundamental underpinning for capital allocation back to individual local authorities. Case study 2 is homes. How do we use demographic methods to inform planning for homes? Well, same again, there's a really tight, strict regulatory and planning environment for each local planning authority. And that local planning authority refers to a local authority district, a unitary authority, a national park, or a strategic planning authority, a sort of amalgamation of local authorities. So each local authority is required to develop and publish a local plan for the delivery of new homes, typically over a 10 to 20 year horizon, probably the shorter end of that range. So local plans are required to address both projected household growth, but also the historic undersupply of homes that has been experienced. And let's look back at the history of UK house building. As you can see, the 60s and 70s, pretty high, typically over 300,000 new homes built per year. That cascaded down to just pre-financial crash in 2007-8. We were back up to about 200,000 new homes per year, but thereafter that plummeted, and some of the lowest levels of new house building were experienced from sort of 2009 up to 2014-15. Things have begun to recover thereafter, only to suffer from the COVID interruption. So you can see that there's a need to sort of not only try and accommodate the impact of future growth, but also there's a need to redress some of the issues associated with underdelivery that's happened over a period of 10 to 15 years. So the UK government's National Planning Policy Framework, NPPF, that provides the regulatory guidance, the content, the method, the collaboration required, and the scrutiny process on local plan development. So that's that the NPPF is now the responsibility for the renamed Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And then the scrutiny process is all coordinated through the Planning Inspectorate. So this sort of local plan development has gone through sort of quite a lot of change over the last 10 or 12 years. But when we first started doing this, we were really trying to help professionalize, for want of a better word, the process by which demographic information was used to support the planning process. And that's not just to use the best data, but also to try and introduce a standardized projection methodology to inform that process. But inevitably, in any study that we would do, we'd be confronted by a historical profile for an area that looked like that. That's a components of population change chart. Hopefully everyone can understand that, but it's the green is natural change, the difference between births and deaths, and then you've got net internal migration, net international migration, and then you've got some orange bits which are the unattributable population change, the uplift or downlift that was made as a result of the 2011 census. So whenever we're sort of approaching a study for a client, we'd be trying to make some sense of what's happened historically. And this is just an example area, city with 2 universities, and you can see that the complexities in here, and that domestic migration internal migration has seen a reduction year on year since the 2011 census, but that's been coupled with very high levels of estimated international migration. And always in doing this work, we're very dependent upon good quality statistics from ONS, has the timeliness at which they're produced, but I've always recognized, given that I've done a lot of work myself around the estimation of international migration, the difficulty of really trying to robustly estimate international migration at a local level, which, looking at what happened as a result of the 2011 census and what's been happening since, there have been continued issues with how accurate we are in actually estimating the localized impact of net immigration, the balance between emigration and immigration. So always the challenge of what data have we got, estimation methods that have been used, and ONS is making some great strides in improving domestic migration, which is great, but that means that that has affected the way that we interpret internal migration, domestic migration in our analysis here, because this onward movement of students, which is now better handled in ONS methods, has had an impact upon the historical data and sort of step change in certain cases in the historical profile for individual areas. And obviously, you get changed new methods, but you also get policy impacts. And as I say, the UK government has changed its guidance a number of times, and we're always having to keep up with that process. So locally, this is again an example area, but this is a typical profile of under delivery following the financial crash in 2007-8, rising again since 2018, with then just this massive COVID interruption where house building has come to not a complete standstill, but has obviously been curtailed by the conditions that we found ourselves in. But the approach that we tried to evolve with the provision of evidence was very much, as I say, to try and professionalize the approach. And we introduced pop group technology to the sector and encouraged people to begin to use that technology with its formal sort of cohort component, single region cohort component model, and an accompanying household model to go with it. So that was good. Introducing that sort of standardized methodology was, well, I think that was very well received, because it removed, certainly from any sort of the inspection process, it removed any issues around the methodology that was being employed. But in doing that, it introduced the ability, I think, for various parties to manipulate growth outcomes, because, as you know, you can vary assumptions and you can produce all sorts of outcomes. So the ability to manipulate growth outcomes using inputs and assumptions proved to be particularly problematic when it came to the review of alternative evidence at inspection. But typically, when we're providing evidence of this type, we'd be looking at a whole range of projections and forecasts. So we'll be integrating these. This is a Welsh area, so this shows the Welsh government's 2014 principal projection was quite a high growth, but that's based upon the continuation of the trajectory of growth in the black line up till about 2014. Thereafter, projections have been lower, so we're needing to be considering the more up-to-date information from the Welsh government, integrating also alternative evidence that has been produced by the GLA in its own forecasting activities, producing our own pop group scenarios, which sort of move on to later evidence that we have available to us on mid-year estimates, and then including also what we call dwelling-led scenarios. What will happen if we continue to build homes at the rate at which we've built them over the last 10 years? Or what would happen if we built homes at a rate of 1,600 per year? So it's sort of it's including within this context of the trend scenarios, also looking at those dwelling-led alternatives. And then finally, possibly the most complex part of this is that inevitably local authorities, house builders are always very keen to consider the interrelationship between demographic change and economic change, which is extremely difficult to get those two to tie up when you're looking at it from a forecasting perspective. But certainly that there are forecasting houses that produce employment forecasts, and routinely we're having to try and take those forecasts and look at the implication of different levels of employment growth upon the changing size and shape of the labour force, given the aging of the population, and therefore on the likely population growth and housing growth that would result from an employment-led scenario versus a dwelling-led scenario versus a trend scenario. It's a complex mix of scenario development, which is providing evidence into a planning authority for which it could informing its deliberations on the development of its local plan. Now, over time, the NPPF has evolved over the last 10 years in an effort to simplify the local plan process. That demographic statistics and the ever-changing nature of statistics and forecasts led to a little bit of a complex local plan process. Particular uncertainty obviously associated with the data and the futures, but that has been critical in the NPPF's drive for what they've termed a standard method. So we now have a replacement, which is a standard method, which is a local housing need, which is now based upon a specific set of rules, of which there are 4. An LHN is based upon household growth for a 10-year baseline, importantly based upon a 2014 based ONS projection. Secondly, it has an affordability adjustment. So where housing is less affordable, there is an upward adjustment in housing need. There's a capping element if necessary. And then there's a cities and urban centres 35% uplift for the top 20 urban local authorities across the UK. So it's become, rather than sort of trying to derive a local housing need from a range of different evidence, there is now a method, a standard method for achieving that. So for Southampton Unitary Authority, for example, the standard method, it has an LHN, a local housing need of 1,389 homes per year, and that's been derived from its baseline household growth in the top left of 877. It's got an upward affordability adjustment of 1,029. There's no cap on that level of increase, but then it also is given a cities and urban centres uplift because it's one of the top 20 largest urban centres in the UK, giving it a total housing growth number of 1,389. And then on the right-hand side, you can see where that thick black line is the LHN, how that relates to past housing growth for this particular local authority. So, the standard method is coming up with a number which is designed to both consider future growth, but also try to redress some of the under delivery that has happened historically. So simplification has certainly been achieved in this case, with the key ambition being the redress of this historic undersupply of homes. But I think what's happening now, the demographic future is clearly changing to a lower growth outlook than the 2014 based evidence on which the standard method is based. The 2014 based growth scenario was a particularly high growth scenario, but now we're looking at lower fertility, dampened life expectancy improvements, and potentially considerably lower international migration, which is all suggesting a lower growth outlook going into the future. So whereas the standard method is doing a great job of simplification and seeking to redress historic undersupply of homes, the underpinning demographics on which is it based certainly will need to be reviewed, I think, in the near future. Moving quickly on, let's get a little bit more complicated and look at water and wastewater. I mean, this is a pretty fundamental part of everybody's life. We need water coming into the house, and we need waste facilities to get rid of our wastewater. And each of the water companies, of which there are a number scattered around the geographical areas of the UK, are mandated to produce plans, rolling 5-year plans, to ensure they have put in place adequate assets and investment to meet the changing size, shape and distribution of the population and the homes and businesses in which those populations reside and work. So the Environment Agency, in conjunction with DEFRA, Welsh Government, Natural Resources Wales and Ofwat, are responsible for the industry's water resource planning guidelines. These guidelines provide the framework for developing water resource management plans, WRMP, and there are now additional guidelines for the development of drainage and wastewater management plans, so the supply of water and then the removal of water. But importantly, this is a little bit circular with the local plan information that we've just been alluding to there. Quote from the guidance to the water companies in delivering this evidence: for companies supplying customers wholly or mainly in England, you will need to base your forecast population and property figures on local plans published by the local council or unitary authority. So fundamentally, the regulator is saying, well, you need to look at how homes are being planned for, and you need to incorporate those plans for new homes into your long-term water resource management plan. So it isn't sufficient to just consider a trend scenario, because that trend scenario is what it is. It's a trend. It isn't necessarily saying, well, this is what is going to happen based upon the number of homes that are going to be built in one area or another. So there is a need, has been a need, to be slightly more creative in what we do for this industry. Now, over the last 5 years, the water industry has formed itself into a series of macro collaborative planning areas, which has been really quite effective. You can see the complexity of the water industry again in the background there of the local authority districts, and the water company geographies are not, as ever, they're not coterminous with the local authority districts. So you can see how Affinity Water, Thames Water, South West Water, etc., all sort of have their own areas of responsibility, which sort of straddle and share borders with each other, but typically overlap administrative geography. But that's the planning geography that certainly we've been confronted with. It's not just about producing evidence for a local authority. Here it's about producing evidence for this macro planning area. But at the same time, given the need for wastewater capacity planning, the need to understand how many homes are going to be built and what impact they're going to have on the local sewage works, as simple as that, we've also had to have a sort of micro level consideration to the analysis. So it's this macro planning areas and micro level consideration that has been the real challenge in terms of trying to provide this sort of robust evidence to the water industry. So the forecasting framework here, again, we've ensured that we always use robust cohort component methods, and the same sort of household model and labour force modelling technology that is necessary to just state that we're actually doing this properly. We're doing this properly, and we're trying to tie all this sort of demographics, housing and economics together into a single perspective from which the water industry executives can use the evidence to plan long term. But the real challenge has been the sort of balancing off of the macro and the micro geographies, bringing in all the local authority planning data for individual local authorities, but also on the sort of micro location of where those new homes are going to or most likely to be built. So underpinned by the whole methodology, underpinned by a large data repository on demographics, housing and the economy, again, but fundamentally underpinned by formal modelling methods. Scenario development has not been that different to the sort of work that we would typically do for local authorities or for strategic planning authorities, but we've had to consider different forecast horizons: short term, medium term, long term. And typically, obviously, in the short term, the data is is quite good, and the plan data is geographically quite detailed, but that geographical detail runs out very quickly. So our medium-term forecasts for the water resource management plan, typical water resource management plan, are having to combine the detail that we get in the short term with less detail in the medium term. And then the long-term view is one in which we're fundamentally having to make some judgments about the long-term effects of fertility, mortality, and very importantly, in international migration. And in all the evidence, whenever we're producing this, again, it's producing housing-led as well as economic-led scenarios, fundamentally benchmarking that at all times with the ONS and also the GLA scenarios that are also out there. And at times it looks horrendous, but the water industry like this sort of information, and we've done some nice stuff with Power BI over the last 3 or 4 years to try and ensure that sort of the cloud dissemination of data and forecasts has made it much easier for us to sort of want to work from home, but also then to be able to quickly disseminate our output and evidence to quite a large number of people within individual water companies and within the sort of combined group of water companies. And that's the range of evidence that we're producing for them. And the complexity there is massive. I mean, it's massive. The difference between the top range growth scenario and the bottom range growth scenario is considerable. So the requirements for macro and micro level planning presents a real challenge for water industry executives, because they're having to sort of convert that into amount of water that is consumed, the amount of water per household or per person that is going to be consumed, any efficiencies that might be introduced over time, but then also the amount of waste that is actually being generated by domestic households and commercial households. So it's quite a complex rolling planning process, of which there are the large amounts of investment required over a long period of time. So the long-term view is one which is fundamental to this sector. But in summarizing those 3 case studies, or summarizing our approach, it's always been necessary for us to understand regulatory guidance and policies. It's not always the case that the people that we're contracted to work for don't necessarily understand the detail of the regulatory guidance and policies themselves, and sometimes the regulatory guidance oversimplifies what is actually achievable. So we very much try and make sure that anything that we do can't be criticized because it doesn't meet regulatory guidelines, because you've always got to make sure that you're actually doing that. You can only use best available data. Never have the perfect data set, never have the perfect data set. So we're always trying to make use of best available data, but we're also always trying to use formal methods in population and pupil cohort models. Presenting evidence visually is absolutely fundamental. Trying to get to, if you can imagine the volume of data that's produced, population data, when you've got a 50-year horizon by area, by age, you quickly get into huge amounts of data detail. But we always consider and present alternative outcomes and with assumptions. But we've always made sure that we're documenting all our inputs, our methods, our outputs, and assumptions. And transparency is absolutely essential. That allows people to try and understand what is a complex mix of geography, demographics, economics that we're trying to put into these evidence bases. But we've also had to, which is a difficult thing, I always found this difficult, expect and respond positively to queries and criticism. And in a lot of cases, we've had to do this, certainly for the local authority stuff. We have to do this within a very formal planning inquiry or planning review, which is tough, because it's you've just got to make sure that you've got that your methodology is rock solid, and the methods that you've used are rock solid. People can still query and question and criticize the outcomes, but if the methodology that you've used and the outputs and assumptions are transparent, then that's sound. It then becomes up to the person that is the inspector who's chairing those meetings to decide who or what is right or wrong. And always interesting and always a challenge, but always good for business, is that evidence needs to be updated as it becomes available, and that's not always it's not always easy. Sometimes there are changes in geographies. We get counties that form from districts, and data released by ONS changes, and all that sort of got to be fed into the way that data is managed and the way that projections are produced. But the updating cycle is an important one. And what's quite exciting, I think, for Edge Analytics, this type of analysis, as we wait for the new census data to become available, it's the start of another decade, which would be good for this type of analysis. To conclude with a few, just a few pointers really about the situation that we find ourselves in. So if we're producing evidence for schools, you can see there are real issues around reducing fertility. For homes and for long-term sort of water use, you can see that the combination of lower fertility and dampened life expectancy improvements and potentially lower international migration is going to lead to a lower growth outlook. So the successive forecasts of the 2020 population have been good, have been quite accurate, but the growth curves thereafter diverge. So those factors, fertility, mortality, and migration components for the UK, suggest that we're moving towards a lower growth outlook. So going back to the components of change chart, that nationally the components of change there, that's 2020 to 2045. This is the 2020 based, the latest 2020 based interim national projection from ONS, which shows the long-term impact of international migration continuing at a sort of net plus 200 per year inflow into the UK, combined with sort of a quickly reducing or reverting to a negative natural change with falling fertility rates and the sort of increased number of deaths resulting from these large birth cohorts working their way through the system, but also what are at the moment dampened improvements in life expectancy. So from a slightly selfish perspective, I'm hoping for a resurgence in life expectancy improvements. My objective is to get to 100. I'm sure my kids will, but I'm trying to get there. I'm trying to get there through healthy old age. That's my current ambition. And then, as the father of 3 daughters, I hope that they can keep the birth numbers up in the next 10 years. But that aside, a lower growth outlook for the UK now looks very likely, particularly if we compare it back to our 2014 based projections, which considerable amount of evidence has been based upon. And just to close, I'm just reading a nice little book by a guy called Kit Yates he's the director of the Centre for Mathematical Biology at the University of Bath. He's written a nice book called The Maths of Life and Death, which is all about the application of mathematical methods to particular business or social issues. And he's referring to some of the stick that people have got recently and the inability or ability to robustly forecast the impact of COVID. But the quote that he made, I think, is very pertinent to the type of work that I've always been involved in. And why bother using models? Well, I'll just read out the quote. Modeling remains the best tool we have to predict the future. It provides a framework, which is always important, to formalize our assumptions about the scenarios we are trying to represent, and to suggest what might happen under different policy options. And it is always a better option to use modelling methods, then relying on the gut feelings or common sense or plain old wishful thinking, that would replace it. And that's certainly been my experience over many years of trying to produce and present this type of evidence to end users. But I think we find ourselves in a period of real uncertainty. Leaving the EU has given us a slightly altered perspective on the long-term impact of international migration. The COVID interruption has now changed things quite considerably. So I think we find ourselves in a situation where, as ever, the future is not what it used to be. Thank you very much.